Hello to everybody who has just joined this webinar. The webinar is organized by ATA Insights as part of a series of renewable energy webinars for renewable energy professionals. Thank you for joining us today. Today's topic is how to organize competitive tenders designed for tariff optimization. With the rapid decreases in the cost of renewables in the last few years, this is a topic of increasing interest to many countries around the world, trying to figure out how to get the most benefit from those decreasing costs. Many countries have transitioned from systems in which prices for renewable energy were fixed, usually at quite a high level, fixed as an incentive to invest. And we're seeing now that as costs come down, many countries see less need to just fix prices as an incentive, but they ask investors to compete, usually on the basis of price. In other words, to compete to show what the minimum subsidy is that they would need to invest. And maybe they need no subsidy at all. Maybe their energy is even cheaper than conventional energy. So our panel, who are great professionals in this area and have a lot to share, are Victoria Karelska, Public Affairs Advisor of Wind Europe, Vikas Kruger from the University of Cape Town, and Ugo Lucas, Head of Energy at Factor. And in a moment, I will ask each of them in turn to introduce themselves a little bit more and to each do their presentation. The presentations will be shared with you a few days from now. And while you're listening to the presentations, you can ask the panelists questions in the Q&A box that you'll see at the bottom of your screen. Please say which panelist you're posing the question to, or if you're posing it to more than one or all of them, please say that too. And they will start answering either in the Q&A box itself, or when it comes to discussion time at the end, they'll answer at that point. They'll each make presentations on specific topics from tenders in different parts of the world. You'll hear the term renewable energy auction used very frequently. That's because it's become the very common term these days. It describes different types of tenders. Sometimes it's the more traditional tender where a country that has a single buyer of electricity procures investment with long-term power purchase agreements, and you bid the lowest possible tariff in the auction. And sometimes it's about countries that have competitive electricity markets instead of single buyers, and then you are bidding for some kind of tariff supplement compared to the competitive electricity market. But the term renewable energy auctions can cover many types of mechanisms. So let me now ask Victoria to make her presentation, and as I mentioned, you can ask her questions in the Q&A box whenever you want. Victoria, please.
Yes, hello. Thank you, Jonathan, for the introduction, and hello to everyone from Brussels. So I'm Victoria. I work for Wind Europe. Wind Europe is the association representing the entire European wind energy industry. We are based here in Brussels, and I myself am a lobbyist, meaning that I need to convince governments that wind is the greatest technology ever and that you need to deploy it in the largest possible volumes. And I will be sharing with you today a couple of insights on how wind energy auctions have worked here in the European Union and what lessons we have learned. So just if you give me 1 second to upload my slides. There we go. So just in terms of a very quick introduction, allow me to mention where does the wind industry stand today in the European Union. So we do have 169 gigawatts of installed capacity across the European Union. And last year, wind energy covered 12% of the European power demand. On the map that you're seeing here, you can see the gigawatts installed in the blue bars for certain countries and also the penetration level per different markets. And you would see that, for instance, some countries like Germany are better in installations, whereas others like Denmark are better in integrating renewables with 44% in the map here. But in general, bear in mind, of course, that in the European Union, we have 28 different markets. We do have common European framework, which is setting the general guidelines on how we need to deploy renewables in these markets, but then it's up to the member state to develop their own legislation and decide how exactly they want to do it at national level. The same thing applies also to auctions, because indeed there has been a lot of worries in the European Union that renewables are maturing very quickly, but that they're overly compensated through feed-in tariffs. So the European institutions decided back in 2014 that there needs to be some sort of European guidance that will ask member states to remunerate renewables through more market-based mechanisms so that we make sure they're not overcompensated. And that was done in this regulation, which is called the State Aid Guidelines. So essentially, the European Union said to all the 28 countries, if you want to remunerate renewables, you need to do it through auctions or through tenders as of 1st of January 2017. And that has been quite a big shift here in these markets, because the European Union came a little bit later to the auctions compared to the developing world. And we're still in the process of transitioning towards auctions. On this map, I just wanted to show you in green all the countries here in the European Union that have already applied tenders since the 1st of January 2017, and also in blue the ones that we are expecting to go to tenders before the end of this year. So we would see for the moment it's mostly a North, Central and South European story. There are many countries in the European Union that will still need to do this transition, but it's upcoming and we're expecting to see more and more of these markets developing their auctions. Now, from a European perspective, of course, the biggest thing has been about the cost reduction trend that we have seen, because the auctions have really delivered a drop in prices. Here you can see the strike prices that were reached for onshore wind ever since 2017. So we have started really with quite significant cost reductions, and you would see in the latest rounds that we've seen in Germany and France this year, these reductions have been a little bit more volatile, and that was very much to do with different permitting processes. And this is essentially the same picture showing for offshore wind. Here, a nota bene that we are showing a different metrics, which is called levelized revenue of electricity. So this is essentially how much 1 megawatt of offshore wind is costing to the final consumer. And this also includes the transmission costs, because we wanted to compare the different results on the same level and adequately. But essentially in offshore wind, the cost reduction has also been quite significant. As many of you know, we have seen also zero bids in Germany and the Netherlands, which essentially meant that developers were not requesting absolutely any public support to develop their project for many different reasons. And I think that the public debate here has been, of course, in case that you're submitting zero bids and in case that you're seeing this cost reduction, why can't we replicate the same prices in different markets? Why are there so many differences? Why can't we just do the same thing everywhere? And in this slide, I just wanted to mention here and underline that, of course, we cannot compare results. We cannot compare apples with pears, because cost reduction is possible in every single market, but to a different extent. And price reductions are also not directly transferable cross markets or cross technologies, because there are many different aspects in the regulatory framework, such as, for instance, permitting or the auction design itself, the support mechanism, that can affect what kind of a price or tariff optimization you receive at the end. And that is one of the biggest lessons that we have learned with the very different auctions that we have seen in the offshore and the onshore sector. And it's still one message that the governments need to really think through and realize that it's happening on the ground. Now, when we design auctions from a European perspective, there are, of course, certain objectives that this auction needs to deliver. And from a purely industry perspective, it's first about, jobs and growth. How do we sustain the supply chain, which is currently in place for our sector? Would these auctions be able to deliver good deployment volumes that will allow us to exploit economies of scale, that will allow us to cut the costs further, that will allow us to develop new technologies, but ultimately also that will make us also able to have different mix of technologies on the grid and have system reliability in the long term. I don't want to focus on all of these priorities as far as we see it, but I would touch base on 1, 2, and 3 because I think that these are the most significant ones. So from an industry perspective, it's really about this. This is a map showing you all the manufacturing sites across the European Union that we have for wind energy. And the idea here is that with auctions, you need to make sure that all of these dots stay on the map, that there is sufficient production in all of them so that you can make sure that you keep people in jobs, but also that you deliver economic benefits to different countries and governments. And how do you do that and how an auction can deliver that? First and foremost, we need to have long-term visibility from the governments on what exactly they're planning to do on wind energy. And this comes with planning. Here on this slide, I'm showing you the auction schedule that the German government introduced back in 2017. And Germany is for the moment the only European country which has this very long-term visibility provided to the industry. It goes up to 2030. So essentially, we know in every single year how much deployment capacity the government is planning for onshore wind, for offshore wind, on which dates the auctions are happening, and how much capacity would be available in each and single auction. And this is extremely important for industrial planning and for making sure that factories are running and that we keep people in jobs. But of course, alongside this sort of visibility and schedule, there are some other elements that also need to be taken into account. And at least the lessons that we have learned over the past year and a half has been as follows. A couple of good practices. First of all, an auction design needs to be really simple. It needs to be understandable, because the more features you introduce into the auction design itself, it makes it even more complex for the developer to understand. It introduces other risks that need to be incorporated in the bids, and ultimately it could actually lead to an increase in the prices instead to a drop of prices. And from that perspective, we're advocating for a design which somehow strikes a balance between what the government wants, but also what's doable for the industry. We're very much in favor of price-only criteria in these designs, and we very much also think that there should be a thorough consultation with the industry so that we can make sure that what the government is putting in place can work for the players that will actually deliver the volumes at the end. Adequate pre-qualification is the second very important thing, because in many European countries we have problems and very long permitting procedures. So from our perspective, it's very important that the developers also provide compulsory permits before they actually go to the auction and bid. And this is very much also related to the fact that this secures delivery of the projects and build out on time. Revenue stabilization very much links to the support mechanism that you're envisaging for wind energy. And from this point of view, we kind of advocate also for a certain sort of price floors, like we have seen also in the Spanish auction. So in a sense, not going below a certain level of an adequate remuneration and not going into negative prices, such as that we've seen in Turkey. And we also think that there should be a very good balance between market exposure for developments and investor risk. And for that perspective, we also advocate for the contract for difference mechanism that we've seen in the UK, and which from our perspective is maybe the best possible way to remunerate renewables. And last but not least, it's a question of your auction design that is really fit for the technology that you want to deploy. And this is what we call technology-specific auctions. Why so? Because technologies are different one from the other, and it's very difficult sometimes to compare and to put them to compete against each other. And this is a lesson that we've learned specifically in the offshore sector, because these are huge infrastructure projects. I'm giving here the example of the Netherlands, which have had a very good approach on how they wanted to deploy offshore wind. They have provided a very good early clarity to investors on what they're planning to do on offshore. They consulted the tender design. They also have done some pre-development of the sites. And so when they started tendering their first båse sites for offshore wind, we have seen in 2 consecutive auction rounds that the prices started dropping. And really with this Dutch experience, we have also unleashed afterwards the full cost reduction trend that we have seen in the offshore sector, also leading to the zero bids in 2017 and 2018 in the Netherlands and in Germany. So really, it's very important also that a government considers the different market maturity of technologies and how they can tailor an auction to the specificities of these technologies. Everything that I have mentioned so far is linked only to the 2020 period. But of course, the European legislation looks into the post-2020 period as well. And as we have different targets at the European level that we need to achieve, the European framework is also trying to tackle and give guidance to the member states on how they need to design their auctions post-2020. So allow me to finish on that and maybe also use it as an opening for the questions. We now have on the table a new regulatory framework for renewables here at the European Union. It's called the Clean Energy Package. And there are four very important elements in there that will be applicable to auctions. The first one is that the European Union has decided to increase its renewable energy ambition for 2030. From 27%, we now have 32%, which also means there is a clear political commitment for renewables that will need to be delivered in some way. The different member states here would also be asked to provide a 5-year schedule for renewable support, which means that they need to outline what capacity of renewables they're planning to tender, when, and how much budget there would be available for these renewables. And this schedule will also be incorporated in what is now called national energy and climate plans. So member states will also have to plan not only the deployment, but also the integration of these new and additional volumes into their national systems. Last but not least, the new framework also defines very clear design rules for auctions, saying that they could be both technology neutral or technology specific, and is also underlining the fact that any remuneration should be done through feed-in premiums, preferably. So I will leave you on that. Thank you very much for listening, and I'm very much looking forward for your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Victoria, for a very clear and informative presentation. I would encourage all participants to start putting questions in the Q&A box. It's a wonderful opportunity to ask questions from all our panelists. I'll actually put a question myself that for Victoria to answer when it comes to the discussion period at the end, which is you mentioned the importance of technology-specific auctions in the European context, European Union context, or for that matter in other parts of the world. And I'm wondering whether you think it would be a good idea to have auctions that ask for a combination of renewable energy technologies and perhaps renewable energy technologies with different types of energy storage technologies. If, for example, a country would like to have 24-hour renewable energy, whether or not the wind is blowing, whether or not the sun is shining, just to hold an auction to say, give me 24-hour renewable energy, and then the bidder figures out the most effective way, the least cost way of providing that. But perhaps you can address that in the discussion period at the end. Can I now ask Vikas to move to his presentation, and maybe Vikas first just say a little bit about yourself and then carry on with the presentation.
Thank you very much. Yes, good evening from a wet Cape Town. We're very lucky that we're having some rain. So my name is Vikas Kruger. I work here at the Graduate School of Business at the University of Cape Town, where I do research on investment into the African power sector, and specifically also then on renewable energy auctions, which is also my PhD topic. So I'm very passionate about this. So let me just quickly pull up this presentation, and we can get started. And I think it's going to be interesting, just because it offers a very different context to that of what we've just heard from Europe. Yeah. So let me quickly go to the first slide, which gives you a bit more information on why this context is so different. The fact is that sub-Saharan Africa is desperately in need of additional power. If you combine the installed capacity in all 47 countries, it has less installed capacity than one European country, that's Spain, and half of that capacity is concentrated in one country alone, which is South Africa. So you end up with, for example, 14 countries with systems smaller than 100 megawatts, which is what, for example, a mine uses in South Africa. So it's really a desperate situation with many people not having power, and those that do have power needing much more and more reliable supply. And so that's the first part of the context. The second is that we don't really have any competitive electricity markets. Most countries have state-owned, vertically integrated utilities, basically monopolies that dominate the systems. Here and there, we see the private sector coming in as IPPs. But in general, you have a single buyer that's this vertically integrated monopoly, and these single buyers are often, most of the time, not investment grade, meaning that they present incredible risks to the investors and the lenders to private power projects, making the whole situation quite difficult to address. So these are the contextual factors that are some of the problems. There are obviously others as well, but some encouraging trends that we've seen is an uptake, especially in Chinese investments. That's been the biggest source of new power in Africa, and most of that's gone to actually large hydro. But then also the private sector has become very active in the African markets recently, and we've seen a lot of that historically going towards thermal power, such as gas, but now we're seeing much more of that going to the renewable sector. And just to give you a quick idea of how that's being procured and why auctions are so important. So if you look at how much most African independent power projects have been procured, you'll see DN, which is directly negotiated. Those are the projects that have dominated, and I think there are several reasons for that, but that's basically where the private sector develops a project, goes to the government and says, this is what we will offer you, this is the price, and they start a long negotiation process. Feed-in tariffs have not really been that successful, except for two countries, which is Namibia and Uganda. So both countries have had relatively quite a number of projects coming online through feed-in tariffs, but most of these projects have been around 5 megawatts each, so not significant. And both of these countries have announced switching to auctions. And ICB is just it means internationally competitive bidding, so it's another way of talking about auctions. You see that that's really not been the main way that power projects have been procured. But if we add South Africa to this, so RSA, Republic of South Africa, you see that this picture changes substantially. And South Africa has actually been, I think, leading auction and design and implementation in many ways, and starting in 2011. And we've seen auctions spreading now across the continent, I think, as a result of what's happened in South Africa. I'll give you a better picture of what that means in a slide or two. Just quickly explaining why auctions have been so significant for the continent. So for a region that is that's really struggling to fund new capacity, that where most people are poor, struggling to pay the tariffs, you want the cheapest power possible. And you can see the price ranges that we've tracked across Africa from the last 20 years. So MSD, medium speed diesel, you'll see competitive procurement delivering much better prices for both fossil fuel generated power as well as solar PV across different jurisdictions. And this is the result. So you'll see the spread of auctions, and as close to 20 countries in Africa are now have announced that they're going to be running auction programs. About half of these announcements have just been in the past year. So it is a very new development, but it is developing quite rapidly. You'll see that, so the dark blue is the countries where projects have actually reached financial close. And the reason why I highlight that is that it's very difficult for projects actually to reach that milestone in Africa. So normally an IPP takes on average about 7 years to reach financial close. So just that's not even construction having started. So auctions projects have actually seen financial close being reached usually within a year or two. So a great indicator for us there. And then you see a number of announcements, but still so many countries struggling to get projects to financial close. And that, again, from an African context, I think just says that an auction can be really designed well, but it will not address all of the issues, I think, that are delaying projects or making it difficult for countries to realize investment. And so there are still a lot of contextual factors that also need to be taken into account when developing these programs. So I'm quickly jumping to a slide just giving you some highlights of what's been happening and some of the key auctions in the continent. And you'll see most of this has been for solar PV. Not very large projects, with the exception of South Africa, where we've had multiple sources of renewable energy. But a few things I wanted to highlight. So the site selection issue is a big issue in Africa. And one of the main reasons for that is just the small size of the grid in most countries, and the grid being able to absorb new capacity. But also the fact that in many African jurisdictions, there, for example, might not be private land ownership. And so government facilitating land ownership, facilitating the preparation of this site is seen by many programs as being essential. Sometimes it can backfire if it's not done well. And I think Zambia's Scaling Solar Round 1 projects have had some of that experience, and which has caused some delays to those projects, but they seem to have been sorted out now. The second thing I wanted to highlight is just when you look at evaluation in Africa, it's been a mix, with some countries going for a price-only evaluation, with others adding some technical issues there, but the price dominates in most countries. In South Africa, I think it's been the only country where economic development, looking at, for example, at things like job creation, at local investment, local employment, local ownership have played really important roles in the evaluation. But interestingly enough, it hasn't actually been used in other African auctions so far. And then I'm just going to highlight some of the prices coming out of the continent. So I think you'll see in South Africa, Zambia, and Senegal, really great prices, and Zambia and Senegal both form part of the Scaling Solar program. So that's being implemented by the IFC, has World Bank backing. So I think it's not a surprise that you actually see almost de-risk prices coming out of these countries. But what I wanted to highlight is Namibia. I think coming out with a price very similar to that in Zambia, but it's a country where investors are being paid in the local currency, in Namibian dollars. Where there's no sovereign guarantee, whereas that is a standard feature of most other African countries. And they've managed to secure very, very good prices for a 37 megawatt PV plant. And so from an African perspective, where we desperately need more power and we need really good priced power, this is a really encouraging development. And again, just to again go back to Namibia's experience, the site was selected by government. There's shareholding by locals, but there's also shareholding by the off-taker, by NamPower. And I think all of these factors combine to somewhat de-risk these projects for countries going forward. And so Namibia, that has been successful in, for example, feed-in tariffs, is also now going to be switching to auctions because of these significant price decreases. So that's really everything from my side for now. You are welcome to email me. There's a host of other publications that we've put out that might be able to give you a bit more context and a bit more details on what we've seen. But yeah, please send through your questions.
Great. Thank you very much, Vikas, for a very comprehensive and interesting presentation. As I did with Victoria, let me put a question to you that maybe you can address when we come to the question time at the end. And meanwhile, I continue to encourage people to put their questions in the Q&A box and send them to the panel. But Vikas, my question for you is, you've very rightly emphasized that in sub-Saharan African countries, there isn't really a case as yet of a country with a competitive wholesale electricity market. The more or less standard model has become a state-owned single buyer of electricity at the wholesale level, probably with some IPPs, not always, but probably with some IPPs, and the single buyer procures from the IPPs under power purchase agreements. And then effectively the single buyer blends all the power to provide power to all the customers, whether it's households or industry or mines or whoever, and manages the prices to each so that the burden on households, the burden on ordinary consumers is not too high. Obviously, how it manages it varies a lot from country to country, but that's kind of the basic principle, that if you have a single buyer model, you have the ability to do that. If you have a competitive market, then you lose some control over it. You lose some control of maybe some benefit, but you still lose some control. Now, with renewables getting progressively much cheaper, and maybe eventually we'll see extremely low prices for renewables as compared to conventional electricity. If I can ask you to look into your crystal ball, do you predict that some countries will start to feel comfortable moving to more competitive wholesale markets and away from the single buyer model, because the need to manage the prices to each class of consumer and to keep prices down for households, for ordinary people, that need won't be so pronounced anymore, won't be so great, because electricity will be so cheap anyway. Maybe that's super optimistic, or maybe it's very realistic, but it would be great to have your view on that in the question time. Let me move now to Hugo Lucas. Hugo, maybe you can say a few words about yourself and then carry on with your presentation. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Jonathan, and thank you to ATA for inviting Factor to present. As you mentioned, my name is Hugo. I'm responsible for energy in Factor. Factor is a global consulting firm. We advise mainly in climate change and energy transition topics. Myself, I'm based in Berlin, but I'm talking to you today from Cairo. And the weekend has started now here in Cairo already. And I can hear there is a wedding going on around me, so I apologize if there is some background noises. So my presentation is on a study that we conducted, we finalized a few months ago. I'm going to try to share with you now on auctions in Latin American region. Okay. Maybe first, a picture of how renewable energy has evolved in the region. First, I would like to apologize because I didn't quote the source. The source is my friends and colleagues from IRENA, the International Renewable Energy Agency. Basically, we can see three things, I think, in these two graphs. The first thing is how much the investment has grown. So from 4.6 to 16.4 from 2005 to 2015. So 3 times the investment in 3 years. And then in the top, we can see that we have now more countries doing large-scale deployment of renewable energies, because in the first year, basically from 70, 80, 90%, it was always Brazil, or Brazil the main market, or almost the only market. And now other countries are coming very strongly, Uruguay, Chile, and Mexico. And in the bottom, we can see that in the beginning and in the first year, it was mainly the so-called conventional renewable energy technologies, so biomass and hydro dominating the market. And now we see that they are the new renewable energy technologies, wind and solar. Of course, part of the success for these new technologies is the implementation of auctions. We can see that in the last year, 85% of the renewable energy electricity was contracted through auction. And in the region, we can find at least 11 countries and the main market that has designed and implemented any kind of renewable energy auction. And with this, I mean renewable energy auction. So with one or several renewable energy technologies. So of course, there are other countries, they have electricity auctions. In this auction, renewable can compete and renewable wind. This is why Chile is not in this list, because they do technology neutral auction. It was already mentioned some of the factors that has pushed for the deployment of auction. Of course, the reduction of the cost, the internalization of the main project developers. And we can see, for instance, how 10 years ago, Argentina already tried an auction, but projects were not online because there were not sufficient bidders, not sufficient experience in the country. The development of local markets, and of course the learning curve as well, because we will see in the lesson learned how policymakers are learning by doing and adapting the design of the auction to the development in the renewable energy markets. And then we can see that in the region, we also have some records as wind in Peru, $37.5 per megawatt hour, or in Mexico very recently, $20.5 per megawatt hour for solar PV. It was mentioned by Vicky before. I mean, well, if you want to attract competition, then you have to give confidence, and one of the best ways to give confidence is to have medium and long-term targets, and this target has to be ambitious but realistic. And then we see how in the Latin American markets, in the main markets, these targets exist. Brazil and Mexico, they have energy planning documents that they are reviewed every year. They have an horizon of 20 years, and you can see there indicative targets for each of the renewable energy technology. You have targets for renewable energy set in the law in Peru, and you have from last year the renewable energy plan of Argentina, again setting targets for renewable energy electricity in the middle term. Very interesting as well is that to have a good running of the process, you have to have institutional capacity. So the actor implementing the auction has to have autonomy first, and second, the resources, the financial and the human resources to run and implement the auction. No? And then we see how the regulator is this actor in Brazil, Uruguay, and Peru. Argentina is the electricity market operator, or Mexico is the electricity system operator. And then it was mentioned by Vicky, it's also important, try to have some kind of schedule for the auction. This is never the case, to be honest, but at least the frequency is clear. So for instance, in Peru, they are now announcing the fourth auction in 6 years. In Mexico, they know that they're going to have one every year. In Brazil, it has happened one at least for the last 10 years. So, I mean, the schedule is a dream, but it's also true that periodicity is happening. Another thing that we have seen in the design is increasing filters to try to avoid underbidding. Trying to get at the end, minimize the risk that the winners of the PPA at the end they don't develop the project. And for this, two main trends, of course, is increasing the requirements both for the bidder and for the projects. More financial reputation and technical reputation for the project developer, and a higher degree of development for the projects that we are bidding. And the other main component to avoid underbidding and failure of projects is the financial guarantees. And almost all the auctions in Latin America, they are asking for the bid bond and completion bond to the bidders. Finally, another design option, it was also mentioned by the colleagues that pay as bid is the simplest. And then sell at bid option again is the simplest, so simplest to implement and also to also for the bidders and the project developers to participate. It is also true that pay as a bid, there is Uruguay that is using this, but it's also true that they have a minimum mandatory local content, and they offer a prime to bidders that goes over this mandatory local content. And then we have seen how, particularly for countries that they are implementing for the first time bids, it is important to have ceiling prices and not to disclose these ceiling prices. Sometimes because of the local regulation, any public tender has to disclose these ceiling prices. Sometimes this happens, but when there are no barriers, and particularly in the beginning, when you may not have sufficient competition, it is important, of course, to have a ceiling price to protect yourself, but also not to disclose to about that all the bids will go with that price. And finally, what is also clear is there is a increasing sophistication in the design, and particularly some increasing sophistication looking forward to achieve secondary objectives. So in the beginning, it was only to get the cheapest electricity as possible, and now is another objectives besides. It was mentioned also the case of South Africa that is looking for social development. So I mentioned already that Uruguay have this mandatory local content. Of course, Argentina and Brazil, they have around the tender some finance instruments for the winner that also demand some local content. Integration, features in the design for better integration of the electricity into the grid. And in this case, Mexico has introduced a factor that will change the merit of order, not the final price they will pay as bid, but they classify, or the merit of order depends on where the value of this electricity is fit into the grid. So wherever is more capacity to evacuate, and also the time during the day and the year where this electricity is going to be fed. Optimal location of projects, also some zoning, for instance, a limitation by zoning in Uruguay and also Peru, of course, depending on the capacity. Some options already are implementing incentives for early entry into operation in the case of Argentina and Uruguay. So they say in the PPA, you will have this fixed price, but if your project is online in advance, I will pay you more for this electricity that you are already producing in advance. No? And there is a proposal, for instance, in Panama to link the merit of order to the reduction of the greenhouse gases. So not only taking into consideration the price, but also the reduction of the greenhouse gases. So once again, moving the design for a secondary objective, which is in this case, climate change mitigation. So this is all I wanted to say in my presentation. Of course, I'm open to any questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Hugo. That was very interesting. That was great. I have a question for you that, again, perhaps you can answer in the question period. You mentioned how some auctions in different Latin American countries are starting to put value on the ability of the electricity to be integrated into the grid if the electricity is a variable renewable origin. I'm wondering if you've seen any cases, or you expect to sometime soon see cases of different types of energy storage being either required as part of a bidding process, or we'll just see bidders putting in storage in order to give more value in terms of integration into the grid, whether it's storage as batteries or thermal storage, perhaps with concentrated solar power or with something else, pump storage, power to gas to hydrogen, whatever it is, whether you think that auction processes will be used to sort of push the development of energy storage and the introduction of energy storage. For the Q&A, could I suggest to people that I see some questions coming through in the chat box, actually. I don't know if all the panelists are looking at that. Why don't, Victoria, why don't you perhaps respond to my earlier question about seeing combinations of technologies in renewable energy auctions in Europe or elsewhere? And then we'll go to perhaps the questions that are in the chat box.
Sure. So the question was, can we, for instance, foresee a combination of different technologies with storage or anything else? I would say that I cannot rule out any possibility, and I think that there is room for pilot auctions for such options to be seen. But it's just to say, in Europe, the debate is not really there yet. What we are trying to do here in Europe at the moment is rather looking at regional cooperation and how countries can do cross-border auctions, so open up a part of their support schemes to support projects in another country. So this is what the focus would be, at least for the next 5 years, as far as we see it here in the European Union. And then to what extent we can foresee different auction types that you're combining different technologies or else. That for me is still a debate for later on, but we're not there yet, definitely.
That's very interesting. Thank you. I wonder if those two things might start going together, though, as you say, you haven't seen it yet. Opening up to imports from other countries, and then at the same time starting to see combinations of technologies, because some countries may have a better resource for one type of technology, other countries for another type of technology, better wind in one, better sunshine resource in another. So it might be interesting to ask for combinations of technologies. But as you say, it's something that's evolving quite rapidly in Europe. Let's perhaps move to some of the questions that are in the chat box rather than the Q&A box. The first one I'm seeing, which I invite any panelist to answer, it's a bit of a difficult question, is the national content requirement a good practice, and what is the best way to implement it? Which of you would like to tackle that thorny subject? Vikas, please.
I mean, I have an opinion. I don't know if it's the right one, but so South Africa's had pretty steep local content requirements. I think about 40%, and they've actually ramped them up over the rounds, and we've seen that being important, at least initially, when renewable energy was actually costing more than conventional power, in terms of providing political support. And securing political support, and that did result in some local manufacturing facilities where there was inverters or wind towers being built in the country. What also happened, and I think it speaks to the importance of what both Victoria and Hugo talked about in terms of the schedule, is that we saw a long delay in the signing of the PPAs for the latest round, which was round 4, and about 2-year delay. And so some of these factories had to close down during that time. And while it is probably adding some cost, I think, to the eventual power being delivered, if we look at how much costs have come down over the 4 rounds. So for PV, for example, it's come down close to 70%. I think 50% for wind. And both these technologies are now sitting at levels way below South Africa's utilities average cost of supply, and at least 40% cheaper than any other conventional power that we could build, whether it's coal or gas. So it might add some price pressure, but I think it's at least in countries like ours that desperately need industrial development, I think it adds something good. It adds to the political support of the program, and if it's managed well, it can be a good incentive. I do think that Brazil's approach, for example, where they make this a condition based on the development financing that's being offered through their development bank, is probably better than where it is a bidding requirement. But I mean, that's a different discussion.
I was muted. Victoria, would you like to add to that?
Just to add on local content, for instance, in the European Union, this is forbidden because it means that you're distorting competition and how you're sourcing components. So in any of the European countries, it would not be possible to have a content requirement in the auctions, for instance. We have seen local content requirements in some of the periphery markets in the European Union, such as Turkey or Ukraine. And despite the fact that there maybe could be some, let's say, benefit of building a local supply chain, again, if your country is not committed to have wind deployment over a very long period of time, then maybe it doesn't make sense really to build any factory in there if you can't produce anything in it.
Okay. Anybody want to add on that question, or should we move to another question? Okay, there's a question. Has any country implemented any type of measure in their auctions to promote a specific technology, e.g., it says solar thermal CPC. I'm not sure what the CPC is, but solar thermal. If so, what was it? That's quite a broad question, but does anybody want to take a specific approach to that? Yeah, please.
Yeah, maybe. I'm sorry again if there is background noises because I can hear already the wedding party. But I don't know if at the end is more disturbing, then I will. On this,
I don't think we can hear it. Although,
okay,
in my experience, weddings in Egypt can be very musical. We can't hear the music.
Thank you very much. I'm glad. So, coming back also to your questions on technology specific, I mean, what we have seen in Latin America is that tender is good for technologies that you can standardize very well the product and the project. So two wind farms are very similar, and of course PV farms are very similar. And also that you have low, maybe it's not the case always for wind, but the least project development cost. For instance, geothermal, it does not make the auction, and they will never win an auction because you need millions for project development before you present your bid. It's also the case for biomass. Biomass, there is not good results of auction in biomass for these two reasons, because there are not two projects from biomass that are the same. There are not two. Each of them, they are different. And second, you need a lot more time and money for project development. So you are not going to start your project development before the auction is announced. And when it's announced, you don't have time to develop your project. So it is clear that it's working very well for standardized and less resource intensive in project development technologies as solar and wind. This is why maybe, of course, for these other technologies, you should go technology specific more. Particularly, Vicky mentioned offshore wind is a special case. Of course, geothermal, I will never do options in geothermal, but okay, or for biomass, so technology specific, because if you do a renewable energy, then it will not be easy for them to compete. Would like to mention that Thailand has an option that storage is included, solar alone or solar with storage, and also regarding variability and the product, also in some Panama auctions, you can offer energy and firm capacity from different projects in your auction. So you can put together solar and hydro, and you are bidding this together in your bid. So it's electricity and firm capacity coming from two different sites in one bid. And of course, another general discussion, not only for auction, is how the concept of firm capacity, particularly for wind, is advancing. No, before we were giving not any reliability to wind, and now they can offer firm capacity. No, we have seen this. This is all I wanted to comment for the moment.
Okay, thank you. I'm seeing some questions in the chat box that would perhaps be easier if somebody answered them in the chat box. For example, somebody's asking 1 megawatt peak AC solar, how much land would it require? I think that's just a factual thing that perhaps one of you could answer either now or later in the chat box. Of course, with PV, these days doesn't necessarily require land. I mean, with the development of floating PV, that can be very interesting in some countries where land has some alternative uses of higher value, whether it's agricultural or urban or whatever it is. There are other questions in the chat box that maybe would be similar. Well, actually, one interesting question some of you may want to respond to. I'm not sure which country it's from, but it's raising the point that one hears in some countries particularly that bidding processes, auctions have led to low solar prices, low by comparison to something, whether it's previous prices in that country or prices in other countries. And some countries, and it tends to be very specific in my perception to particular countries, some countries worry whether that low price is somehow sustainable, meaning either whether the project actually gets built or whether the price gets respected for the full length of PPA, if it is a PPA. I mean, I find this a very interesting question because in some countries I've seen that question raised when PV was coming in at, say, 6 cents per kilowatt hour, and then a couple of years later it comes in at 2 or 3 cents a kilowatt hour. People raise the same question: is this low price sustainable when the 6 was not actually low, because now you've got 2 or 3 only a couple of years later? I wonder whether it's just a question of how long mindsets change. But maybe there's a real question there. What do people think about the sustainability of low PV prices?
I mean, I'm happy to.
Please.
I'm happy to react. One comment in the previous question about the need for land. What we have also seen that the most important key factor at the end for bidding very low is the resource, which means that at the end all the projects are concentrated where you have the higher resources. And you can see in the options in Peru, where at the end a small project is asking for the same price as a big project located in the same area with the same number of hours, equivalent hours. So what is important for bidding and is becoming now a challenge, and it's also countries looking to adapt the design to avoid concentration of all the projects in one region, because it's the region with the most resources, and this is one of the not good effects of auctions. Regarding the sustainability of low prices, it is, basically it's going to depend if they are indexed in time. No, of course, you don't submit a bid if you think you are not going to make money. And at the end, most of the time, it's already the rule in the PPA that these prices are indexed, of course, during these 20 years. So, of course, whatever they are giving to you the first year is going to be updated in each year. No? Depending on the countries, then part is updated with international standard, part with local standards, or maybe the investment in different formula to update the price that for the operation and maintenance cost. So these are my two comments on the questions.
Okay, would somebody else like to react to that question about prices?
I mean, sorry, I just have a short additional comment, which is the World Bank's done a study, and they actually published a paper in I think Energy Policy recently, where they looked exactly at this question for developing countries. And I mean, their findings were that these prices are sustainable. Some of them you see additional how can I say, concessionary elements in some markets, and that will give you some lower prices. But in general, there's no reason, I guess, to be concerned about these prices. And I think again, it also comes back to what Hugo was saying. You know, these are projects with with real people putting real money into it for 20 years. They want to make sure that they get their money back over that period. And I don't think they're going to be taking unreasonable risk, especially if it's project finance, where banks are leaning into these projects, and they need to make sure that they're getting that money back. So from our perspective, I think we're definitely happy to see these price reductions, and we think we're probably going to see hopefully more in African markets, but also globally.
Okay, great, thank you. I think the other questions in the chat box and in the Q&A box are probably best answered by text, because some of them are specific factual things. Vikas, I wondered if you'd had a chance to think about the question I asked earlier about whether we think some sub-Saharan African countries may feel able to move towards more competitive wholesale electricity markets because renewables are getting so cheap.
Sure. I have to answer this in I guess in two parts, because I can talk about South Africa, and that is a very different country than the rest of the continent. And so in South Africa, the introduction of renewables have really, I guess, threatened the monopoly of Eskom, and we've seen them use their power to block renewables. But Eskom
actually, I was hoping I was hoping you would mention that very point.
And so, I mean, there are definitely calls for the South African electricity sector to be unbundled, to at least for generation to be split off, for there to be an independent system operator. But Eskom is a very powerful institution in the country, and we are hoping that we see better markets developing as a result of the introduction of renewable energy. I mean, before our auctions, we had zero private participation in the country's electricity sector. So this has definitely opened up the market. In other African countries, most of them, it's a difficult situation because most countries don't actually have cost-reflective tariffs. And so for renewables, they'll have to come down in price quite a bit still, I think, before they get to a level where governments are comfortable that they're offering them low enough prices for them to be able to pass that through to customers and not be worried. But I think in many countries, especially countries where most of the generation is based on thermal power, especially diesel, they'd be very keen on introducing more power that is not dependent on global oil markets, and I think we can see opening up in countries like Uganda and to a degree, and I guess in Kenya, but also Nigeria. It's not a smooth ride for, I guess, any of these countries yet, but we are seeing encouraging signs in many of these markets, at least on the generation side. I think there's a long way to go on in terms of developing fully competitive markets, but at least in terms of splitting off generation and getting a good system operator to contract fairly, as it would be a big get for Africa at this stage.
Great, thank you. If I can ask a follow-on question. You mentioned the South Africa case and the resistance of some elements in Eskom and let's say associated interests. So do you think countries in sub-Saharan Africa or elsewhere in the world, but countries in sub-Saharan Africa would be well advised to move away from the single buyer model and towards a competitive model, in a sense, to make it more difficult for now expensive sort of vested interests in conventional electricity and the fuel suppliers to that electricity, to make it more difficult for them to resist cheaper renewables coming onto the system, because they're using monopoly power to resist competition, and it's the rest of the economy and people and the rest of society that pays the cost for that. Would you, if you were advising sub-Saharan African countries, would you advise them move faster to competitive wholesale markets than you might have been planning before renewables became so cheap?
Yes, definitely we would be. I think there's a good case for having a strong system operator to be able to, as I said, contract fairly and on a transparent basis. And there are different forces at work in different countries. I actually have one of my colleagues is doing a lot of work on the political economy or power sector reform in Africa, and this is a key question that she's looking at. In general, we see this, working well in countries that have good functioning electricity markets. That being said, though, if we look at the countries that have been able to attract the most private investment into their generation sector, it's not necessarily countries that have unbundled or even countries with an independent regulator, but it is countries that have good planning capacity, where they plan well for what they need. They know when they will need it, and they can then decide fairly whether this goes to the public sector, whether this goes to the private sector, and that plan is then translated into competitive procurement in a timely manner. And I think that's if we look at the factors that are important for bringing at least private investment in the African renewable sector, or just in terms of generation generally, that stands out as a really core element. I think reform is perhaps a later step, and it sometimes, like in South Africa, I think it's almost forced by the introduction of private capacity. That obviously makes financial sense, and I think in many countries like South Africa, the transition is almost inevitable, and utilities need to catch up to the transition.
Yeah, I think that's very true. I think the bottom line really is that renewables and very cheap renewables are changing the way that people think, and should change the way that people think about how the different elements of reform and policy and regulation, how they fit together. In a sense, we need a different model from the old model. I mean, whether one should unbundle, whether the regulator should be independent, what possibilities are there really for cost recovery, and all those standard questions, in a sense, have been rearranged by how cheap renewables are. Maybe that's a topic for a future webinar from ATA. I think at this point we've sort of gone over time. So let me thank everybody. Thank the panel for great presentations and great responses. Thank everybody for participating online. Just a reminder, you will be receiving the PowerPoints in a few days. And let me say goodbye to everybody, and thank you very much.